to see your face. Pass me by the crowds of people, the priest who sing your praise.
Hello, my name is Shane Idleman, and I'm the pastor of Westside Christian Fellowship in Leona Valley, California. It is my personal heart and goal for you to see truth through a biblical perspective. I hope that you enjoy this segment of Idleman Unplugged.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Idleman Unplugged. My name is Luke Duncan and I'm your host here with Pastor Shane Idleman. Pastor, welcome.
Welcome. Good to be here.
So we got a question here recently, Pastor, about house churches. And we know that the early church, that was what they did. That was the model of fellowship that they had, because there weren't any other buildings around. There weren't any really other places of congregation outside of just the houses of believers.
Right.
And there are still some people in our community also that do the house church model as well. So in a day and age where we have, especially where we have like mega churches and big buildings and things like that, is there a place for house churches? And for those who fellowship within house churches, how do they relate to the church as a whole?
Wow, that's a good setup. That's a lot right there. And I should probably let the listeners know this is actually a true Idleman Unplugged, because we're at our house. So you might hear kids come running in and crying and
Dog drinking water. Stuff like that.
I mean, who knows? We're just in the living room having fun and just seeking God's will. But anyway, yeah, this question's interesting because, our house church is biblical. I get the emails, the calls, that people ask, and you just running into people. So obviously house churches are biblical. I mean, that's a no-brainer. That's how the early church started. And, it grew. So let me just try to hit this from a couple different angles. First, I think the reason, because I do know people that, like the King James only camp, it's the house church only camp. It's the, they put the only on everything, suit and tie only when you're preaching. So we just got to be careful in this area. Where I think the criticism has come in, and rightly so, is when you get to some of these large churches spending, 20, 30, 40,000 on a building. I know even in our area, there's a building that was built. It was, I think, $18 million, and their payments around $80,000 a month. Yes, you heard me correctly. So they get some criticism for that, and rightly so. I mean, we've never had to cross that bridge. Just so the listener knows, we were actually given a campus, on the tax records, like $2.5 million. We were given a campus, not really given, but there was a small amount.
We inherited one.
Yeah, we inherited one, and there wasn't a large balance, so we just doubled up on the payments for a year and paid it off. And so now we actually own our campus outright. So you have a lot of different scenarios. So I think people see, tons of money going into this building, $1 million sound system, if not 5 million or 10, whatever, for TV. And so, I can see why people are thinking that. Have we gone too elaborate in many places? Sure. A friend of mine has a mega church in Bakersfield. Actually, they just took an industrial building, just a huge empty industrial building. And so instead of spending 20 million, I think they spent 2 million. And it's incredible inside there. So that's why they caught a lot of heat, from spending money unwisely and being too elaborate. And God's, the early church was simple to the, just fellowship, hymnals, guitar, not even guitar. Well, obviously, maybe some, and psalms, let us.
Yeah. Hums.
Yeah, harps and flutes. And, so you see that simple gathering. So, and then also you have at a certain level, you cannot pastor people, very well, because, you're really not their pastor anymore because, in our case, if I think we have 700, 800 families calling Westside their church, so how many people does that mean? They're actually, it doesn't mean they come all the time, but, I run into people all the time. Oh, you're my pastor. I listen to you on the radio, or we stop by once every quarter. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, nice to meet you. So who knows? That's such a broad term. My point was, you can't lead people effectively, if there's more than, I don't even know. I've been seeing lots of numbers out there, 50 people, probably one pastor, 50 people to shepherd accordingly. But like in our case, we have how many great elders and deacons, which you are one. I mean, I can list, a half dozen good deacons right now that are counseling people and helping people. And then we have core team members that are help. So we actually have a lot of people carrying the load. I don't think anybody falls through the cracks whatsoever. But that's another reason, because it's just too big. But then some of the reasons get silly, like, well, that's the only model. That's the only model we have in the early church. Well, how do you know that? I mean, there's early church fathers that you can read that talked about meeting in large gatherings. And for example, you mentioned your area where you live, there's houses out there on 2.5 acres. Let's say you're having a home group, and your home group of 20 people, and now you're 25, and now you're in the living. It's like, man, let's go use the barn out back. Let's put 50 chairs in there. Let's go. Well, so now are you using a building, and you crossing that line there? It just gets silly, because of course, if God's blessing a ministry and it's growing and outgrowing what you're using, that's usually like Calvary Chapel started with home groups, and then they outgrow their home and they got a small building. So my whole point in answering this could have been a lot easier, is if they're spending money the right way, they're frugal, they're using wisdom, they've got missionaries, and they're not overspending. And I for the life of me can't find how it could be wrong, even from a biblical perspective, because if God's adding to the church. Now people say, well, you should have this person plant a church and this person plant that. Well, a lot of people who think they should plant churches aren't called. They're not. How do you know God hasn't called them? And that's one of the Acts 29. I don't know if you've heard that church planting movement. They many years ago recognized that they're planting people way too quick who are not called. So it's better to just wait and see who's actually called. Plus, if you have, let's say, dynamic leaders, I had the privilege of visiting Pastor Jack Graham and his church and talking with him when I was in Texas, and then took a tour of Gateway, Robert Morris. And then you have John MacArthur here an hour from us. And, so these are polarizing figures. It's not bad, I don't think. I think God has given them a corporate anointing, or not corporate, but you call it an anointing to reach the masses. And you think of Tony Evans there in Texas as well, solid Bible teacher. He's on our Westside Radio network. So, people gravitate towards that. They're going to want to go listen to Tony. I would, other than maybe somebody not quite called, not quite gifted, really doesn't speak into my life, isn't really applicable. And, so I think God gives a variety of different options for that very reason. So house churches, very biblical. But I believe churches and buildings, very biblical, as long as God's guiding. For example, let's just throw out our church, for example. And I do get emails that, over the last 10 years, maybe a dozen, that, you're in sin. It isn't God's model. And so you have to think from it, just use common sense. So God called us to start the church in a building. He didn't call us to start in our home. I know that for a fact. The doors were incredible that opened. And then he gave us a campus, right, where people are being blessed, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people being blessed. And then now people being blessed all over the United States. The fruit of what God is doing is absolutely incredible, more than we would have ever imagined. And so for people to say that's not the right model, I think is ignorant at its best, or very judgmental at worst. People just kind of picking apart. And I've noticed, this is just a general statement, those, up in the Midwest, I think it was, or Northern California, the emails I got a while back, or read this book or do this, they promote it because they've only got 12 or 15 people in their house. So they think they're the standard, and it's kind of God hasn't really maybe called them or gifted them well. And so they try to, shoot down other churches. So you rarely see, I guess I've never seen a person who says biblical, the house churches are the only biblical model, from people who are really humble and broken and contrite and teachable. It's always coming from a judgmental, arrogant spirit. And so that's why we have to reject, that mindset. Now, can we learn from their comments? Of course, on spending. For example, let's say we have $1 million gift to come in. Do we go get $1 million building? Or do we get, let's say we do need a building, or do you get a, $200,000 building and then use that money better elsewhere? So anyway, that's my 2 thoughts on that topic. Yeah. 2 cents on that topic.
Yeah. I think that, when we talk about stuff like that, it raises issues that are, that we have to consider a broad context for a lot of these things too, because if we talk about, like in this case, we're talking about the meeting place for the body, for the gathering, you know, and it's like, you could, if you wanted to get technical, you could say, well, you can't meet in a cave because a cave's not a house or whatever, you know.
Oh, that's true.
Like,
yeah.
It's like, you know, and
open field.
I think, yeah, you know, and I think that when we get down to stuff, that we just have to be careful too. The danger, I think, that we are not a perfect church, a big C church.
Right. You
know, everybody in the church is only there by God's grace, and that's it. So when we talk about stuff like this, whether it's something like a meeting location, or, you know, translational preference, or this, that, or the other thing, even if we assumed the other person's position that, okay, we're not doing it properly and it needs to change or whatever, it doesn't mean that you all got it figured out either.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it also doesn't necessarily mean that it's handicapping God's work.
Yeah,
because
good point.
If God only moved through a perfect vessel, then he ain't been moving for a while.
Yeah,
you know,
that's true.
So he's the master of drawing straight lines with crooked sticks.
Yep.
You know, so I think that that's one thing that when we talk about this and we talk about other issues where it could become a source of division within the church, that we just have to remember that what are we really saying to one another? Are we encouraging each other to be more biblical, or are we trying to put ourselves in a position that gets in the way of somebody else's relationship with the Lord?
Yep.
And I think we just have to be sensitive to that, regardless of whatever your perspective is.
And a healthy church would also have home groups. So you would actually supplement whatever you're lacking in that. So anyway, I think we covered that one. Oh, I should remind people too that we're moving a lot of our ministry things over to parler.com, PARLER.com. And we'll still use Facebook, Twitter, all those things, but you're seeing that the voice of conservatism is slowly being drowned out, and that's right now an unbiased free speech type of platform, kind of like Facebook on parler.com. So we're going to be promoting the heck out of that to let people know about switching at some point.
So for those who are interested in the platform, or who may already have a presence on the platform of Parler, be sure to look us up. Westside Christian Fellowship, Shane Idleman, and you will get connected with all of our resources on that platform as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for listening to this episode of Idleman Unplugged today. If you have a topic or a question that you would like to hear on the podcast, please let us know. Send us an email at westsidechristianfellowship.org or shaneidleman.com, and we'd be happy to set aside an episode to talk about it. We thank you for listening to this episode today. My name is Luke Duncan, and I'm your host here with Pastor Shane Idleman. Join us again on the next episode of Idleman Unplugged.
Thank you for listening to Idleman Unplugged. For more information, visit us at shaneidleman.com. Again, that's shaneidleman.com. El Paseo Publications proudly supports the Westside Christian Fellowship Radio Network. We are committed to quality and Christian publication. Free ebooks can be found at westsidechristianfellowship.org under free ebooks. Books such as What Works for Men and What Works for Young Adults will help readers understand that the obstacles ahead are never greater than God's power to take you through. Books such as What Works When Diets Don't and Feasting and Fasting demonstrate how health can be achieved from a biblical perspective. Other free books such as Answers for a Confused Church and Desperate for More of God show the importance of fully surrendering our lives to Christ. And One Nation Above God is a must-read for anyone concerned about the direction of America. Again, free downloads of these ebooks are available at westsidechristianfellowship.org. We are happy about partnering with the Westside Christian Fellowship Radio Network.